The wife noticed the change before she understood the danger. Her husband had started smiling too softly, speaking too gently, and watching her in ways that made her heart feel cold. "You don't trust me?" he asked one night, almost amused. She forced a faint smile, but something deep inside her whispered that the silence in that house was no longer ordinary. And before the week would end, one quiet dinner would leave that family shattered forever. Hello, beautiful people, welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Also, comment where you're watching from. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Morning entered the Cole home softly, touching polished floors, expensive curtains, and walls that held more silence than warmth. Gina moved carefully through the kitchen, setting out breakfast with the quiet habit of someone who had learned to make herself small inside her own home. Wayne sat at the table in a crisp shirt, reading messages on his phone without looking up. "Your tea is getting cold," Gina said gently. "I know," he replied, not unkindly but without feeling. Even simple words between them felt tired. From the outside, they looked like a peaceful couple. Inside the house, however, everything felt paused, as if love had stepped away long ago. Gina carried her smile like a fragile thing she was afraid to drop. She kept telling herself that difficult seasons happened in marriage, that hearts could soften again, that one kind conversation might change everything. Yet every time she looked at Wayne, she felt something colder than distance. It was not anger exactly. It was something watchful, something measured. When he finally lifted his eyes to her, she looked away first. "Are you going out later?" he asked. "Only to the store," she answered. He nodded slowly as if nodding something important. The moment passed, but unease stayed behind, settling quietly into her chest like a warning. By afternoon, Wayne had become the version of himself the world adored. At the office, his voice was calm, his handshake firm, his smile polished and easy. People praised his discipline, his intelligence, and the dignity with which he carried his family name. Gina had seen strangers light up around him, as though they were standing near someone dependable and kind. Even when she accompanied him to public events, she watched him transform effortlessly. "You're lucky to have such a thoughtful husband," a woman once told her. Gina smiled and thanked her, though the words had landed heavily inside her. She did not know how to explain the difference between appearances and home. Later that day, Gina met Laura at a quiet cafe. Laura studied her face for a long moment before stirring her drink. "You look tired," she said softly. Gina tried to laugh it off. "Just poor sleep." Laura leaned closer. "No, Gina, you look sad." Gina lowered her eyes and folded her hands together to stop them from shaking. She wanted to tell the truth, but truth felt dangerous even in small pieces. "Marriage can be complicated," she said instead. Laura reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Complicated is one thing, lonely is another." Gina smiled weakly, but Laura's words followed her all the way home. Vera Cole never needed to raise her voice to make people uneasy. Her presence alone carried authority. She was elegant, exact, and deeply aware of how things should look, how they should sound, and how they should be managed. When she entered a room, Gina instinctively straightened her shoulders. Vera rarely insulted her directly, yet approval from her came so sparingly that Gina had spent years trying to earn a softness that seldom appeared. "The flowers are too bright," Vera remarked that evening while stepping into the sitting room. "A house should feel refined, not loud." Gina quietly nodded and moved the arrangement, though she had chosen it with care earlier that morning. Still, Vera saw more than she said. While Wayne ignored Gina's small efforts, Vera noticed them all: the freshly ironed napkins, the careful meals, the way Gina often paused before answering her husband, as if weighing the safest tone. Vera also noticed Wayne's detachment, the polite indifference that had become second nature to him. During tea, she watched Gina hand Wayne his cup without meeting his eyes. "You should rest more," Vera said suddenly. Gina looked surprised. "I'm all right." Vera gave a short nod, but her gaze lingered. Beneath her sharp manner lived a private restlessness, one she had not yet named, but which had already begun to trouble her deeply. That night, while folding clothes in the bedroom, Gina found herself drifting back to the early days of her engagement. At the time, she had mistaken Wayne's reserve for seriousness, his quietness for maturity. Vera had spoken often of family values, stability, and how well Gina's grace suited the Cole household. Wayne had agreed to everything with polite calm, never rude, never warm, and never fully present. Looking back now, Gina remembered moments she had dismissed too quickly, the delayed replies, the formal compliments, the way his affection always felt learned rather than natural. Even on their wedding day, some hidden part of her had sensed that he was standing beside her, but not truly choosing her. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands, remembering conversations that now felt painfully different. "He's not expressive," Vera had told her once years ago, "but he will grow into the marriage." Gina had believed her because she wanted to. She wanted to think love could be built by patience, by decency, by enduring the early coldness until something warmer arrived. It never truly did. When Wayne came into the room that evening, he loosened his tie and asked, "Why are you still awake?" Gina forced a small smile. "Just thinking," he nodded without interest. "Try not to think too much," he said. The words sounded ordinary, yet somehow they stung. Over the next week, Wayne began asking questions that seemed harmless on their own but unsettling together. One evening, while Gina arranged books in the lounge, he asked, "Do you still keep your insurance papers in the bedroom drawer?" She looked up, confused. "Yes, I think so." "Why?" Wayne shrugged and loosened his watch. "No reason. I was organizing some documents in my study and wondered." The next night he asked whether she still locked her side of the house before sleeping. Another time, he casually asked what she usually ate when he worked late. Each question came lightly, almost absent-mindedly, but each one left behind a faint chill Gina could not ignore. Soon, even rest stopped feeling safe. Gina began waking before dawn, her heart racing for reasons she could not explain. The house would be quiet, Wayne asleep beside her, yet her body would be tense as if bracing for something unseen. She would lie still and listen to the silence, wondering when a home had begun to feel like a place where she had to stay alert. "You're restless these days," Wayne remarked one morning as she spilled tea into her saucer. "I suppose I'm just tired," Gina answered. He watched her for a moment too long. "Then you should take better care of yourself," he said. She nodded, but fear had already started taking root. Then came a softer version of Wayne, one that should have comforted Gina but somehow did the opposite. He asked if she had slept better. He brought home fruit she liked. He even paused in the doorway one evening and said, "That color suits you." Gina turned to him in surprise because months had passed since he had offered any gentle remark. "Thank you," she said quietly. For a second, she wanted to believe something was changing. But when she met his eyes, the warmth in his voice was not there. His words had been kind, yet his gaze remained distant, almost clinical, as though he were rehearsing the part of a caring husband rather than feeling it. That growing contradiction unsettled her more than coldness ever had. Coldness was honest in its own way. This new kindness felt arranged. Gina began noticing how carefully Wayne observed her reactions. If she smiled, he seemed to store the moment away. If she looked uncertain, he would become gentler still, but never naturally. One evening he placed a plate of sliced fruit beside her and said, "You should eat more. You hardly touch anything these days." Gina stared at the bowl before answering, "I didn't realize you noticed." Wayne's mouth curved slightly, though it was not quite a smile. "I notice more than you think," he said. The words troubled her long after he left. A few afternoons later, Gina went into Wayne's study to dust the shelves. She had no intention of searching through anything, only to finish her chores before Vera's scheduled visit. While wiping the bottom drawer of a cabinet, she noticed an old phone tucked behind a stack of unused files. It looked forgotten, almost careless in the way it had been hidden. She hesitated, then picked it up. Something in her had become too alert to dismiss quiet oddities. After charging it, she entered the code Wayne had once used years ago, more out of instinct than certainty. When the screen opened, her stomach tightened before she even knew why. The messages were not what she expected. There were no secret declarations of love, no foolish exchanges with another woman. Instead, Wayne's conversations with Billy were short, cold, and disturbingly practical. Words like timing, dosage, and make it look natural appeared in ways that made Gina's fingers go numb. One message read, "It has to happen at home." No noise, no scene. Another simply said, "She trusts you too much." Gina nearly dropped the phone. Her breathing turned shallow, her knees weak. She sat down hard in Wayne's desk chair and whispered, "No, no, Wayne." But the screen kept glowing in her hand, and the truth was impossible to unsee. The next day felt longer than any day Gina could remember. Every movement inside the house required effort. She smiled when spoken to, answered questions carefully, and moved around Wayne as if nothing had changed. Inside, however, she was trembling. She could not confront him. He would explain the messages away, or worse, realize she had seen them. She thought of going to the police, but the words on the phone were indirect, not enough for certainty in the eyes of others. The person in danger was herself, and somehow that made the world feel even lonelier. She had proof of fear, but not proof enough to feel protected. Wayne came home that evening and kissed the air near her cheek, a gesture so unusual that Gina nearly flinched. "How was your day?" he asked while placing his keys on the table. "Quiet," she answered. "And yours?" He loosened his collar. "Productive." She nodded and turned back toward the kitchen before he could study her expression too closely. Every normal act now felt like performance. She set plates, poured water, and kept her voice steady, but internally she was no longer the same woman who kept hoping things would improve. She had crossed into another reality entirely, a reality where survival depended on silence, timing, and pretending not to be afraid. For hours Gina considered who, if anyone, she could trust. Laura loved her, but Laura's fear would show too quickly. The police felt far away, formal, uncertain. Billy was clearly part of whatever Wayne was planning. That left only one person who truly understood Wayne's hidden nature, even if she never admitted it, Vera. The thought of going to her felt almost unbearable. Their history was complicated, full of strained respect and quiet wounds. Still, Gina knew that if danger was growing inside this house, Vera would recognize its shape faster than anyone else. Trembling, Gina called and asked if she could come by privately. Vera's answer was brief: "Come now." When Gina placed the old phone in Vera's hands, the older woman frowned in irritation first, as if offended by the mere suggestion that her son could be involved in something dark. "This had better not be some misunderstanding," she said. Gina swallowed hard. "I wish it were." Vera adjusted her glasses and began reading. The first few messages hardened her face. The next few changed it. Her posture, always firm, seemed to lose its certainty inch by inch. "Read this one," Gina whispered, pointing. Vera did. Silence stretched between them. At last she lowered the phone slowly, her voice thinner than usual. "Leave that with me," she said, "and say nothing to Wayne." Vera read the messages again in the privacy of her sitting room, one after another, as though repetition might soften their meaning. Gina sat on the far edge of the sofa, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had expected anger, denial, perhaps even blame. Instead, Vera grew quieter with every passing minute. The silence in the room became heavy, full of something deeper than shock. Finally, Vera asked, "Are you certain he does not know you found this?" Gina nodded. "I'm certain." Vera closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, there was a grief in them Gina had never seen before. It was the grief of a mother recognizing a truth she could no longer refuse. For the first time in years, Vera allowed herself to connect small memories she had kept pushing aside. The impatience in Wayne's voice, the cold ambition in his eyes, the ways he spoke of people when they could no longer benefit him. None of it had seemed enough on its own. Together it became something terrible. "This did not begin yesterday," Vera said quietly, more to herself than to Gina. "I should have seen it for what it was." Gina's voice shook. "What do I do?" Vera looked at her, not with her usual severity but with painful clarity. "You stay calm," she said, "and tonight you do exactly as I say." Vera's instructions were simple, but the force behind them came from a place Gina had never seen in her before. "You will not confront him. You will not show fear. You will cook dinner as usual, speak as usual, and let him believe everything remains unchanged." Gina stared at her, startled by how controlled Vera sounded despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "And if she could not finish the sentence. Vera did it for her. "If he tries anything, I will be watching." Her voice was firm, yet it carried an ache that made Gina's chest tight. For once, they were not mother-in-law and daughter-in-law standing apart. They were two women standing inside the same danger. When Vera rose to leave, she paused at the door and looked back. "Do not panic," she said softly. "Fear makes people careless." Gina nodded, though panic had already wrapped itself around her ribs. The house felt altered the moment she returned. The same walls stood around her, the same furniture, the same familiar rooms, yet everything looked sharper now, as though her eyes had been forced open. Wayne called once from work to say he would be home on time. "Make something light," he said. Gina's fingers tightened around the phone. "All right," she answered. As the call ended, she glanced toward the front gate. Vera would arrive before dinner. That promise became her only steady breath. That evening the kitchen seemed louder than it had ever been. The chopping of vegetables, the low simmer of sauce, the soft clang of spoons against pots, all of it sounded amplified by fear. Gina measured ingredients carefully, though her hands trembled each time she reached for a plate. Vera stood nearby, not interfering but watchful in a way that made the air feel even tighter. Neither woman spoke much. Too many words might break the fragile control they were both fighting to keep. Once, Gina nearly dropped a serving spoon. Vera caught her wrist lightly and said, "Steady." Gina nodded, swallowing the tears threatening to rise. "I'm trying," she whispered. Wayne arrived exactly when he said he would. His expression was calm, his tie slightly loosened, his voice easy. "Smells nice in here," he said while stepping into the kitchen. Gina forced herself to smile. "Dinner is almost ready." He glanced at Vera and seemed mildly surprised to find her there. "Mother," he said, "I didn't know you were staying." Vera folded her hands. "I felt like family dinner." Wayne's eyes rested on both women for a second, unreadable. Then his phone rang. He stepped aside to answer it, speaking in a low tone Gina could not fully hear. Every ordinary movement inside the kitchen now carried unbearable tension, because all three of them knew in different ways that something irreversible was drawing close. When Wayne ended the call, he returned with the same calm face and reached for a glass of water. Gina was setting the final plates on the counter when she saw it. The brief movement of his hand, almost casual, almost practiced. He stood close enough to her place setting to touch it without drawing attention. Something small slipped from his fingers and disappeared into the food. He stirred lightly with the edge of a spoon, then stepped back as though nothing unusual had happened. Gina felt the blood drain from her face. Across the kitchen, Vera had seen it too. Their eyes met only for a second, but the truth passed clearly between them. Neither woman reacted. That restraint made the moment feel even heavier. Gina picked up the plate meant for her, willing her hands not to betray her. Wayne glanced at her and asked, "Are you all right? You look pale." She forced a small smile that barely held. "I'm fine, just tired." Vera said nothing, but her stare followed her son with a sorrow deeper than anger. This was not rumor or suspicion anymore. A mother had just watched her own child prepare harm with steady hands. As they moved toward the dining table, the room seemed to narrow around them. The food was served, the chairs were pulled out, and still the house remained quiet as if waiting to see who would break first. For a few minutes the meal proceeded with unbearable normalcy. Wayne cut into his food. Vera lifted her glass. Gina sat before the plate that had just become a threat in plain sight. Then Wayne's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, muttered something about work, and stepped away from the table. The moment was so brief that it almost did not feel real, yet fear moved faster than thought. Gina reached for her plate with shaking fingers and switched it with Wayne's. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. She was not thinking about revenge in that instant. She was thinking only of staying alive, of not becoming a quiet tragedy hidden behind polished walls. But Vera noticed at once. Leaning forward, she gripped Gina's wrist under the table. Her voice was barely a whisper, but sharp with emotion. "No," she breathed. "You will not become like him." Gina's eyes filled immediately. "Then what do I do?" she whispered back, her lips trembling. "He means to hurt me." Vera held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly released her hand. "Let me handle this," she said. Her face was stern, but there was pain in it now, and something else too, regret. Gina sat frozen, torn between terror and helplessness, while the sound of Wayne's voice drifted from the next room and the dinner table waited silently between them. Before Wayne returned, Vera moved with sudden decisiveness. She drew the plate away from both Gina and Wayne and placed it beside her own, as though merely rearranging the table to suit herself. "This serving is too generous," she said aloud, turning the moment into something ordinary. Gina understood at once that Vera meant to keep the plate untouched until she could confront Wayne privately. Perhaps she would save it, perhaps show it to Fred, perhaps finally force her son to face what he had done. For one fragile moment, the possibility of surviving the night without another disaster seemed real. Gina exhaled shakily, though fear still pressed hard against her chest. Then Wayne came back. He looked first at Gina, then at Vera, then at the moved plates. The change was small, but he noticed it immediately. "Why did you switch the places?" he asked, his tone casual enough to hide the sharpness beneath it. Vera lifted her fork with practiced calm. "I didn't like the arrangement." Wayne held her gaze for a beat too long. "Since when do you care where the plates sit?" Gina lowered her eyes, afraid her face might reveal too much. Vera answered coolly, "Since I'm eating at this table." Something flickered in Wayne's expression, not certainty, but suspicion. The danger had not passed. It had simply changed direction. Wayne sat down again, but the air around the table had altered beyond repair. He asked small, pointed questions with a softness that felt more threatening than open anger. "You're both very quiet tonight," he said. "Should I be worried?" Gina murmured. "We're just tired." Vera gave him a long look. "Not every silence is about you, Wayne." The remark landed hard. He set down his fork. "You always do this," he said. "Turn everything into a lesson." Vera's expression hardened. "And you turn everything into a wound whenever someone sees through you." Gina looked between them, her breath shallow. Beneath the polished surface of dinner, years of tension had begun rising too quickly to contain. The conversation grew sharper, though never loud enough to sound wild. That quiet bitterness made it hurt more. Wayne accused Vera of controlling every choice he had ever made. Vera replied that guidance only feels like control to people who resent accountability. "You chose your life," she told him. "No," Wayne said coldly. "You chose it for me." Gina sat trapped between them, her hands tight in her lap, realizing that the dinner had become more than a moment of danger. It had opened old fractures buried beneath years of good manners and appearances. Here, in the strained light of the dining room, the family's deepest wounds were finally beginning to speak aloud. The argument did not end in shouting. It ended in wounded silence, which somehow felt worse. Wayne pushed back his chair and stood. "I'm not staying here to be judged in my own house," he said. Vera replied, "Then leave before you say something you cannot take back." He gave Gina one unreadable look, grabbed his keys, and walked out. The front door closed with controlled force. For a moment, neither woman moved. The plates remained on the table, half-touched, the meal forgotten in emotional exhaustion. Gina reached for a glass of water. Vera sat back slowly, as though suddenly older than she had looked earlier that evening. The room was still, but not peaceful. What happened next was so ordinary that its weight would haunt Gina forever. In the quiet after Wayne's departure, Vera shifted plates absent-mindedly while continuing to speak about calling Fred in the morning. Gina cleared one dish, then another, distracted and shaken. Vera, lost in thought, lifted a fork and took a few bites from the plate she had pulled away earlier, perhaps without fully noticing which one it was. Gina turned back only when Vera set the fork down and rubbed her temple. "You should rest," Gina said softly. Vera nodded, looking tired but not unwell enough to cause alarm. That ordinary, almost invisible moment settled over the night like a shadow no one yet understood. Later that evening, Gina found Vera sitting on the edge of her bed, one hand pressed lightly against her stomach. The older woman's face looked pale beneath the warm bedroom lamp, though she tried to dismiss it. "It's probably just stress," Vera said when Gina asked if she was all right. Gina brought her water and helped her sit back against the pillows. Their movements with each other felt unfamiliar, gentle in a way their relationship had rarely been. Vera watched her for a moment and said quietly, "You have been kinder than this house deserved." Gina's throat tightened. "Please don't say that." Vera looked away. "Some truths come late," she murmured. "That does not make them untrue." As the night deepened, Vera's strength seemed to fade little by little. She asked Gina to bring Fred's number in the morning and to remind her about some papers in the study. Then, after a long silence, she asked a question that stayed in Gina's heart long after. If a woman tries to correct her mistake too late, does it still count? Gina frowned, confused and emotional. What mistake? Vera gave a faint, tired smile. The kind a mother makes when she mistakes obedience for goodness. Gina did not understand fully, but she sat beside her until Vera's breathing softened. When she finally left the room, unease followed her like a prayer she did not know how to say. At dawn, the house was unusually still. Gina woke with the strange heaviness that had already become familiar to her, but this morning it felt sharper, more urgent. She wrapped a robe around herself and went first to the kitchen, then paused, remembering Vera's pale face from the night before. Carrying a cup of tea, she walked to Vera's room and knocked softly. There was no response. "Vera," she called, then pushed the door open a little wider. The tea slipped from her hand before she understood what she was seeing. Vera lay still against the pillows, her face calm. Her room filled with a silence so final that Gina's scream tore through the house before she could stop it. Within minutes, workers, neighbors, and the household staff were running through the corridor in confusion. Someone called the doctor. Someone else began crying. Gina stood frozen near the bed, unable to move, unable to stop shaking. Grief hit her in layers: shock, guilt, disbelief, and the unbearable knowledge hiding beneath them all. The woman who had often made her feel small had also, in the end, stood between her and danger. "No, no," Gina kept whispering, but the words changed nothing. The house filled with mourning before the sun had fully risen, and inside that gathering sorrow, Gina felt the weight of a truth far too terrible to speak aloud. Wayne returned later, expecting a very different kind of silence. He had left the night before in anger, certain that whatever unease had passed around the dinner table would settle by morning in his favor. Instead, as he entered the gate, he saw people gathered in dark clothing, cars parked along the drive, and neighbors speaking in hushed voices. He slowed at once. "What happened?" he asked a worker near the front steps. The man looked stricken. "Sir, your mother." Wayne stared at him, unable to process the words. "What about my mother?" By the time he crossed the doorway, the answer had already begun to show itself in the faces around him. The shock that struck Wayne was real. He had imagined injury, collapse, perhaps even an empty house waiting for him, but not this, not Vera. He stood in the hall as mourning swirled around him, his expression pulled between horror and confusion. Then he saw Gina. She stood near the staircase, her eyes swollen from crying, her face pale with more than grief. Something in the way she looked at him made his blood run cold. There was no softness left there, no uncertainty, no hopeful confusion. She knew. Wayne understood it instantly, and that understanding passed between them without a word. From that moment, the house became a place neither of them could fully hide inside anymore. The next 2 days passed beneath the slow weight of mourning. Relatives arrived, prayers were said, and Vera's name filled the house in quiet reverence. People remembered her discipline, her sharp intelligence, her sacrifices as a mother and widow. Some spoke of her strictness with affection, others with careful respect. Gina listened through tears, feeling the contradiction of her grief. Vera had wounded her in many quiet ways, yet had also become the person who believed her when no one else could. That truth sat heavily inside her. Every condolence offered to Gina seemed to brush against a private pain no one in the room could fully understand. Wayne moved through the rituals like a man wearing sorrow correctly, but his composure had started to crack at the edges. He asked too casually whether Vera had said anything unusual before the night ended. He looked into drawers, studied faces, and lingered too long near the study. Gina noticed everything. So did a few of the older relatives, though they could not name what felt wrong. Once, while people gathered in the lounge, Wayne stepped near Gina and said under his breath, "If you have something to say, say it." Gina did not look at him. "Not yet," she whispered. Her calm frightened him more than accusation would have. As funeral preparations continued, Gina found herself remembering Vera in fragments that now felt different. A harsh comment from years earlier no longer sounded merely cruel. It sounded like a warning from someone who had seen rot in the house before Gina could name it. Times when Vera had interrupted Wayne's decisions, questioned his temper, or insisted on being present during family matters, now seemed less controlling and more protective in ways Gina had failed to understand. "Why did you never say it plainly?" Gina whispered one afternoon while standing alone in Vera's room. The room held no answer, only the faint scent of perfume and the emptiness left behind by unfinished conversations. That quiet reflection softened something inside Gina, though it also deepened her sorrow. Vera had not been easy to love. She had chosen pride too often, had pushed too hard, and had mistaken control for wisdom. Yet beneath all that, she had clearly carried fears she never knew how to voice. Gina sat by the window, holding one of Vera's folded scarves, and let herself cry without restraint. For the first time, she grieved not only the woman Vera had been, but the woman she might have become if regret had reached her earlier. In death, the sharp edges of their bond had not disappeared. They had simply turned into a different kind of ache. Fred Lawson arrived on the third day, stepping out of his car with the grave composure of a man who understood that mourning was not the only matter waiting inside the Cole home. He greeted the family with quiet respect, shook Wayne's hand, and offered Gina a look that held more concern than formality. Vera had trusted Fred for years, and everyone knew he handled her legal affairs with unusual discretion. "I came as soon as I could," he said. Wayne nodded stiffly. "Thank you." But Fred's gaze traveled briefly to the study hallway before returning to the room, and Gina sensed at once that his visit carried purpose beyond condolences. Later that evening, Fred requested a private moment with Gina in the garden, where the wind moved gently through the hedges and the mourners' voices softened into the background. "Vera contacted me recently," he said carefully. Gina's heartbeat quickened. "About what?" Fred looked at her for a long moment, choosing his words. "She said that if anything happened unexpectedly, certain documents must remain untouched until after the burial." Gina felt fear and hope rise together. "Did she say why?" Fred's expression turned solemn. "Only that truth delayed can still be truth." From the veranda, Wayne watched them speaking and tightened his jaw, clearly unsettled by whatever he could not hear. The day of the burial arrived beneath a gray, muted sky that seemed to mirror the heaviness in the family's hearts. Gina dressed in black with trembling hands, pausing more than once because grief kept tightening her throat. Laura came early and held her for a long moment before they left. "You don't have to carry all this alone," Laura whispered. Gina closed her eyes briefly. "I know." At the cemetery, prayers rose softly, and Vera's casket was lowered with the solemn dignity she would have expected in life. Wayne stood rigid, his face strained and pale. If anyone saw how shaken he truly was, they said nothing aloud. Sorrow made every silence feel sacred. Billy appeared near the back of the gathered mourners, dressed simply, his face carefully composed. Gina noticed him because he avoided looking at Wayne directly. That avoidance said more than any open glance could have. Laura, standing beside Gina, leaned close and whispered, "Do you know him?" Gina kept her eyes forward. "I know enough." As the final prayers ended, Gina stared at the casket and felt tears spill quietly down her face. In that moment, she thanked Vera in the privacy of her heart, for believing her, for stepping in, for trying too late but still trying. The burial did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something that could no longer be buried. That evening, after the family returned from the burial, Fred gathered the closest relatives in the formal sitting room. The curtains were drawn against the fading light, and the atmosphere carried the exhaustion of grief mixed with quiet anticipation. Wayne sat stiffly in an armchair, expecting a customary legal statement about property and remembrance. Gina remained near the far end of the room, Laura beside her for strength. Fred unfolded a sealed document with great care and said, "This was written by Vera Cole in her own hand and left with instructions to be read after her burial." The room grew still. Even the smallest sound seemed to retreat. Fred began reading, and Vera's words entered the room with more honesty than anyone had expected. She wrote first of regret, not dramatic regret, but the slow, painful kind that ripens over years. She admitted that she had pressured Wayne into marrying Gina because she believed Gina's grace, background, and steadiness would strengthen the family's image. She confessed that she had mistaken order for peace and appearances for truth. Wayne's face changed as Fred read on. Gina lowered her eyes, tears gathering anew. Vera's voice, carried through the page, seemed to fill every corner of the room. I believed I was building stability. I did not see I was laying silence over a wound that never healed. Fred continued reading while the room sat in stunned quiet. Vera did not excuse Wayne, nor did she protect herself with soft language. She wrote that a mother can spend years praising discipline while failing to teach tenderness, and that power inside a home can become dangerous when it is mistaken for love. Then came the line that seemed to stop the air itself. My son chose darkness, but I built the house where that darkness learned to hide. Laura covered her mouth. One of the older relatives whispered, "Oh, Vera." Wayne looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Gina closed her eyes because the truth of those words was as heartbreaking as it was undeniable. The statement did not sound like accusation alone. It sounded like grief, shame, and the final honesty of a woman who knew she had run out of time to mend what she helped damage. Fred's voice remained steady, but emotion tightened it slightly as he read the final paragraphs. Vera wrote that Gina had entered the family with more patience than it deserved, and that her own harshness toward her had come partly from fear that she had forced two lives together without ever asking whether love could grow there honestly. Wayne did not argue. For the first time, silence failed to protect him. His mother had seen him clearly, and from beyond the grave she had refused to hide what that vision cost her. When Fred folded the letter, the room remained suspended in shocked quiet. Wayne finally lifted his head and said, with controlled strain, "My mother was grieving when she wrote that. Pain can make people dramatic." It was the first open attempt to soften what had just been heard, and it broke something inside Gina. She rose slowly, her hands trembling, and walked toward the center table. "Then maybe this will help," she said. From her handbag she pulled the old phone and placed it before Fred. Wayne's expression changed at once. Laura turned toward Gina in confusion. "What is that?" she asked. Gina's voice shook, but it did not fail. "The reason Vera believed me." Fred opened the phone, read several messages, and his face tightened with disbelief and sorrow. Laura let out a soft gasp when she saw the words. Billy's name appeared again and again, alongside phrases too cold to misunderstand. Wayne stood up. "That proves nothing," he said too quickly. Gina looked at him then, truly looked at him, and the pain in her eyes made the whole room still. "It proves I was afraid in my own home," she said. "It proves your mother believed me because she saw enough to know who you had become." She was not triumphant. She was breaking open in front of everyone, and that vulnerability gave her truth more power than anger ever could. The room had barely recovered from the phone when Fred reached into his briefcase again. "There is one more note," he said quietly. "This one was written for Wayne alone, but Vera stated that if the contents of the earlier letter were ever challenged, this must also be read aloud." Wayne's face hardened. "That won't be necessary." Fred met his eyes calmly. "Vera thought otherwise." He unfolded the paper and began. The note was shorter, more personal, stripped of legal formality. It spoke directly from mother to son, not with fury, but with a sorrow so intimate that everyone listening felt almost ashamed to witness it. Then Fred read the line that seemed to take the last of Wayne's strength. "I should have taught him how to love, not only how to win." Wayne sat back down heavily, the color draining from his face. No one spoke. There was nothing sharp or dramatic in Vera's words, which made them even harder to bear. She was not condemning him from a distance. She was grieving the child she had raised into a man who learned ambition, pride, and control, but not mercy. Wayne lowered his head into his hands, not because the room now judged him, but because his mother's final understanding of him had been sorrow, and sorrow cuts deeper than anger. In the days that followed, consequences slowly began closing in around the house. Questions were asked more formally. Billy stopped answering calls. Fred remained involved with quiet determination, making sure Vera's instructions were followed carefully. Yet the emotional center of everything remained Gina. She walked through the house like someone learning it for the first time, touching the back of Vera's chair, the hallway rail, the kitchen counter where the dinner had been prepared. Survival did not feel victorious. It felt heavy. Every room held echoes, The whisper under the table, the moved plate, Vera's tired voice in the bedroom asking whether a late correction still counted for something. Laura stayed close and gently urged Gina to think about leaving. "You don't owe these walls anything," she said while helping her fold clothes. Gina sat on the bed, staring at an old scarf of Vera's she had not yet packed away. "I know I have to go," she answered, "but part of me still can't believe she's gone." Laura sat beside her. "You don't have to understand all of it at once." Gina nodded slowly. The woman she had once feared had died trying to protect her, and that truth had reshaped grief into something complicated and lifelong. To live on would mean carrying both the pain of betrayal and the weight of being saved. On the morning Gina finally left, the house was unusually quiet again, but no longer in the same way as before. This silence did not belong to fear waiting to be named. It belonged to endings. She closed the final suitcase, looked once around the room she had spent years trying to make peaceful, and let herself breathe deeply. In her handbag were Vera's letters, the old phone, and the small personal things grief would not let her abandon. Wayne remained in another part of the house, diminished by everything that had surfaced, unable to restore what had been broken long before that dinner. Gina did not go to him. Some farewells do not require words. At the front door, Laura waited beside the car. Gina paused only once to look back at the home that had held so much silence, longing, and hidden danger. She thought of Vera's final words, of the mistakes that pride can disguise, of the cost of a life built on appearances instead of love. Her eyes filled, but she did not turn away. "Are you ready?" Laura asked softly. Gina nodded. "Not fully," she said, "but I'm going." And that was enough. She stepped outside with pain, strength, and the beginning of a future she would have to build slowly for herself. Behind her, the house remained standing, but the silence inside it had finally been broken. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.